The wind carried the smell of dust and dry grass across the plains when Sarah McConnell stepped out of the bank, her trembling fingers clutching the folded notice that spelled out her ruin. Her husband had been gone for nearly a year, taken too young by a fever that left her with nothing but their small cabin, a pile of unpaid debts, and a hollow ache in her chest. The creditors were circling now, sharp-eyed men who cared nothing for her grief. She had tried to work the land herself, to raise the few head of cattle left behind, but with each season the bills stacked higher, and the whispers in town grew colder. She walked down the wooden steps, her black dress worn from too many days of mourning, her eyes scanning the dirt road that cut through the heart of Dry Creek. The sun was lowering, casting long shadows against the false front stores, when she heard boots strike the ground with a steady rhythm. Turning, she saw him, Luke Tanner, a man most folks respected, though many kept their distance. He was a rancher, strong in his silence, raising his boy alone since his wife had died in childbirth 5 years earlier. People said he had buried his grief in work and kept to himself, but Sarah remembered his eyes, gray, steady, holding a weight she recognized. He stopped a few paces from her, his hat low against the light, his hand resting easy on his belt. "You're in trouble," he said quietly, not as gossip but as fact. She stiffened, the notice crumpling in her palm. "It's none of your concern." Yet her voice betrayed the exhaustion she carried. Luke studied her, then glanced at the slip of paper she tried to hide. "Bank's going to take your land," he said, his words neither cruel nor gentle, but as certain as the setting sun. "And without land, you'll have nothing left." Her throat tightened, but pride kept her chin high. "I'll find a way," she whispered. Luke's gaze lingered on her for a moment, then shifted toward the street where his boy, Thomas, waited by the hitching post. The child was thin but sturdy, eyes bright with curiosity as he watched his father. Luke's jaw flexed as though he wrestled with words before speaking. "There might be a way, if you'll hear it." Sarah hesitated, then nodded faintly. "I can't promise much," Luke said slowly, his voice low. "But I can give you my name. A home. The bank won't touch a widow who's remarried, and my boy could use a mother. You'd be safe, and my son wouldn't grow up without a woman's hand to guide him." The words struck her like a stone tossed into still water, ripples of fear and hope colliding. Marriage, to a man she hardly knew beyond stolen glances and polite exchanges. Yet the desperation in her chest told her she had little choice. "Why me?" she asked, her voice fragile. Luke looked at her then, truly looked, and she saw not just the hard lines of a rancher but the quiet sorrow of a man who understood loss. "Because you're strong enough to survive what's been given to you. Same as me." That night, she sat awake in her cabin, staring at the single lantern flame as it flickered against the walls. Her husband's memory lingered in every corner, but so did the shadow of hunger, the cold thread of the banker's hand. Could she take another man's name, another man's life, and step into it as though it were her own? Her hand brushed the folded notice on the table, and with trembling resolve, she made her choice. The wedding was simple, witnessed by the preacher and a few curious neighbors who murmured behind their hands. Sarah wore the same black dress, though she tied a white ribbon at her waist, and Luke stood beside her, solemn as ever, with his boy clutching his hand. When the preacher pronounced them man and wife, Luke didn't kiss her, just nodded once, as though a pact had been sealed between them. Moving into Luke's ranch felt like stepping into another world. The house was larger, sturdier than her cabin, but filled with silence that spoke of years endured in quiet loneliness. Thomas watched her with cautious eyes, unsure whether to trust her presence. Sarah found herself sweeping, cooking, tending small tasks, not because Luke asked but because the house carried a weight of neglect. Slowly, she began to stitch herself into the rhythm of their days. One evening, as the sun bled red across the horizon, she stood on the porch, watching Luke work the corral. His movements were steady, his shoulders broad, his hands sure as he guided the cattle. She realized then that beneath his silence lay a steady strength that had carried him through his own storms. When he finally came inside, dust streaking his shirt, she set supper on the table without a word. He glanced at her, and though neither spoke, something passed between them, an unspoken understanding that this fragile arrangement was beginning to grow roots. Thomas was the first to soften. One night, he brought her a book, holding it out shyly. "Mama used to read this," he said, his voice small. Sarah took it gently, her heart aching at the trust in his eyes. She read aloud by lamplight, her voice filling the room with a warmth the walls had long been denied. Luke sat nearby, his gaze fixed on the fire, but she noticed the way his shoulders eased as her voice wrapped around them. Days turned to weeks, and the ranch slowly became hers as much as his. The townsfolk whispered less, and the banker, finding her debts settled, kept his distance. Yet it was not the safety of Luke's name that steadied her heart, it was the man himself. Though he rarely spoke, when he did, his words carried weight. He mended a fence with the same quiet resolve as he comforted his boy, and Sarah found herself drawn to the quiet fire within him. One night, after a storm rolled heavy across the plains, rattling windows and flooding the low fields, she found him in the barn, repairing the latch. The lantern light cast sharp lines across his face, and for the first time she reached out, her hand brushing his arm. He stilled, his gray eyes meeting hers, and for a long moment neither moved. Then, in a voice roughened by years of silence, he said, "You've given this house life again." Her breath caught, her hand lingering on his sleeve. "And you've given me a place to belong." The barn was filled with the sound of rain, the scent of hay, and the weight of two broken souls finding something whole in each other. In that moment, Sarah realized their union had grown beyond necessity, beyond survival. It had become something neither of them had dared hope for, a chance at love, carved out of loss and stitched together with quiet strength. And when Luke finally pulled her into his arms, it was not as a man rescuing a widow, nor as a woman saving a rancher, but as two hearts finding their way home. The wind swept hard across the empty plains as Sarah McConnell pressed her hand to the folded notice the banker had given her. Her chest was tight, her breath shallow, and though she tried to steady herself, the ground beneath her boots felt as though it were shifting. Everything she had clung to since her husband's death, her home, her land, her dignity, was slipping through her fingers. Her husband, James, had been a good man but a poor rancher, more dreamer than worker, always borrowing against next season's promise. When the fever took him, it left Sarah with nothing but a handful of cattle, a tangle of unpaid debts, and a cabin that felt less like shelter and more like a burden. For months she fought to keep the creditors at bay, hoping the land could carry her through. But the drought starved her crops, the cattle dwindled, and now the bank was ready to strip away even the last shred of her husband's memory. As she stepped down from the wooden steps of Dry Creek's bank, the sun hung low, throwing shadows that stretched across the dusty street. Her eyes burned with unshed tears, though her back remained straight. She would not let the townsfolk see her break. They already whispered about her debts, about her pride, about how a young widow couldn't keep a ranch afloat on her own. The sound of steady boots behind her made her turn. Luke Tanner stood a few paces away, tall and broad, his hat pulled low. He was a man who rarely spoke more than a few words at a time, yet people listened when he did. His life had been marked by loss as well. His wife had died bringing their son into the world, leaving him to raise the boy alone. Folks said he buried himself in work, pouring his strength into the land while saying little to anyone. But Sarah remembered his eyes, gray and watchful, carrying a weight that mirrored her own. "You're in trouble," he said. His voice was quiet, certain. Sarah's hand tightened around the paper. "It's none of your concern." Luke's gaze didn't waver. He nodded toward the folded notice she tried to conceal. "Bank's taking your land. Without land, there's nothing left." The truth in his words cut deep. She lifted her chin, summoning pride though her voice was thin. "I'll find a way." Luke shifted slightly, glancing down the street where his son, Thomas, waited by the hitching post. The boy couldn't have been more than 10, lean from work but sturdy, his eyes bright with curiosity. After a pause, Luke said, "There might be a way. If you'll hear it." Her heart thudded in her chest. "Go on." "I can't promise you much," Luke said, "but I can give you my name. A home. The bank won't touch you if you're remarried. And my boy could use a mother." His words were simple, not dressed in sentiment, but they carried a gravity that made her knees weaken. The notion stunned her. Marriage. To Luke Tanner, a man she barely knew, beyond polite greetings in town and the occasional nod at church. She stared at him, searching for hidden motives. "Why me?" she whispered. His eyes met hers, steady as stone. "Because you're strong enough to stand. You've carried what most wouldn't survive. Same as me." That night, Sarah sat awake in her cabin, the single lantern flame flickering against the worn walls. Her late husband's presence haunted every corner, his boots by the door, his hat hanging unused on the peg. To take another man's name felt like betrayal. Yet what loyalty did she owe to memories that had left her in ruin? She thought of the banker's cold smile, of the endless bills piling like stones around her. She thought, too, of the boy waiting at the hitching post, his face turned toward his father with quiet trust. Slowly, painfully, she made her choice. The wedding was plain. A ribbon of white tied at her waist was the only token of joy against the black dress she had worn too long. The preacher read the words. A handful of neighbors gathered to watch, their whispers cutting sharp through the ceremony. Luke stood tall beside her, Thomas clutching his hand. When the vows were spoken, Luke did not kiss her, only gave a solemn nod, as if binding them with a promise deeper than any outward display. Sarah moved into the Tanner ranch the next morning. It was larger than her cabin, sturdy and well kept, but silent. Years of grief had stripped it of warmth. Luke worked from dawn until nightfall, his strength poured into the land. Thomas watched her with wary eyes, as if unsure whether she belonged. She busied herself with small tasks, scrubbing floors, mending curtains, cooking meals. The work steadied her hands, though her heart still trembled. Weeks passed. Slowly, the edges of silence softened. One evening, as the sun fell blood-red behind the horizon, Sarah stood on the porch watching Luke drive the cattle into the corral. His movements were steady, purposeful, as though each gesture was carved from the earth itself. When he came in, dust on his shirt and sweat streaking his brow, she had supper waiting. He glanced at her once, not speaking, but something flickered in his eyes, acknowledgement, perhaps gratitude. It was Thomas who bridged the distance first. One night, he brought her a worn book and held it out with shy hands. "Mama used to read this," he said, voice low. The words pierced Sarah's chest. She took the book, cradling it as if it were something holy. That evening she read aloud by lamplight, her voice weaving through the room like a thread. Luke sat nearby, his gaze fixed on the fire, but she noticed his shoulders ease, the furrow in his brow loosening. The rhythm of life began to shift. She rose before dawn to prepare meals, worked alongside Thomas in the garden, mended Luke's shirts when they tore. The townsfolk's whispers grew quieter. Some looked at her with respect now, others with suspicion, as though she had tricked her way into security. But Sarah felt herself growing into the shape of her new life. Still, the nights stretched long. She would lie awake, listening to the creak of the windmill outside, wondering if Luke saw her as anything more than a shield against the bank, a caretaker for his boy. Yet there were moments, fleeting, unspoken, that hinted at something deeper. The way his eyes lingered when she laughed with Thomas. The quiet comfort of his presence when they shared a meal. The way he always made certain she walked inside before he did, as though placing her safety above his own. Then came the storm. One evening, black clouds rolled across the plains, lightning splitting the sky, rain lashing against the earth with a fury that shook the ranch. Sarah ran to the barn, finding Luke there, lantern in hand, securing the doors against the wind. His shirt clung to his frame, his face set with grim focus. "You shouldn't be here," he said, voice sharp with concern. "I couldn't stay inside," she replied. Her hand caught his arm, steadying herself against the shaking ground. Their eyes met, and for a heartbeat the storm outside seemed to vanish. "You've brought life back into this house," he murmured, almost to himself. Her throat tightened. "And you've given me a place to belong." The lantern flickered, rain beating the roof above, the scent of hay and earth thick in the air. In that moment, something broke free inside them both. His hand brushed against hers, and though no words followed, the silence spoke more than any vow could hold. The storm passed by dawn, leaving the plains soaked and glistening beneath the rising sun. The land smelled of rain and earth, the sky washed clean, but within the Tanner ranch something deeper had shifted. Sarah moved through the house with quiet hands, preparing breakfast, yet her mind lingered on the barn, on the way Luke's eyes had held hers, on the weight of his words. She felt as though she had stepped across an invisible line, and though nothing outward had changed, everything within her had. Luke came in from the fields later that morning, his hat damp, his boots heavy with mud. He paused at the doorway, studying her with the same unreadable expression he had worn since they wed. Yet now, beneath the stillness, there was a current she could almost feel. When Thomas ran to him, asking about the cattle, Luke's voice softened, his hand resting briefly on the boy's head before turning toward her. For the first time, she did not see a man hardened by loss, but one who carried both strength and longing. A man who had learned to live in silence yet yearned for something beyond it. Life at the ranch pressed forward. The storm had broken fences, flooded the lower pasture, and ruined part of the garden. Sarah worked beside Thomas repairing what they could, her skirts muddy, her hands raw, yet she found herself smiling through the labor. When Luke joined them, hammering posts into the sodden earth, she caught the faintest curve of his mouth. A smile not fully formed but real enough to warm her. The boy grew more attached to her with each passing day. He began to follow her in the kitchen, asking questions about cooking, about sewing, about her own childhood. At night he asked her to read, his head resting against her shoulder as the lamplight flickered. One evening, after finishing a story, he whispered, "I'm glad you're here." The words struck deep into her chest, and when she looked up, Luke was watching from the doorway, his expression shadowed yet filled with something unspoken. The town, however, was less forgiving. Some whispered that Sarah had married Luke for survival, that she had clung to his name like a lifeline to escape ruin. The banker sneered openly when she passed, muttering about women who sold themselves for security. Sarah felt the sting of their judgment, but Luke's quiet steadiness kept her upright. He never spoke of the whispers, never defended himself or her aloud, but his presence at her side, the way he guided Thomas's hand into hers each Sunday at church, spoke volumes no words could. Still, Sarah wrestled with doubt. Did Luke see her as a partner, or merely as someone who filled the empty spaces of his life? At night, lying awake in the bed they shared but did not yet truly share, she longed to ask him what he saw when he looked at her. Yet her pride, and her fear of the answer, bound her tongue. The answer came not in words, but in fire. It was late summer when the blaze struck. A bolt of lightning, fierce and sudden, ignited the dry grass at the edge of the Tanner property. Within hours the flames swept wild, devouring fence lines, threatening the cattle. Luke and Thomas rushed to fight it, and without thought, Sarah joined them. She beat back flames with a soaked blanket, her arms burning, her lungs filled with smoke. In the chaos, she saw Thomas stumble, nearly swallowed by fire. Without hesitation, she threw herself toward him, shielding the boy with her own body, pulling him clear until Luke's arms closed around them both. When the fire was finally beaten back, the pasture blackened but the ranch spared, Sarah collapsed against the earth, coughing, her dress singed. Luke knelt beside her, his hand gripping hers with a desperation she had never seen in him. His voice, rough and broken, tore from his chest. "Don't ever risk yourself like that again. I can't lose you too." The words struck her harder than the fire's heat. She turned her face toward him, his eyes blazing with something fiercer than anger, fear, love, need. She reached for his cheek, her soot-stained fingers trembling. "You won't lose me," she whispered. That night, as the flames died down in the distance and the ranch lay wrapped in uneasy silence, Luke entered the kitchen where she sat, her arm bandaged, her hair loose around her shoulders. He stood for a long moment, then crossed to her and knelt. "You've given everything for this place, for Thomas, for me. I can't keep silent anymore." His voice shook, though his eyes held steady. "I married you to save you from the bank. But somewhere along the way, you saved me instead. I don't just want you here, I need you here. Not as a duty, not as a name, as my wife, as the woman I love." Her breath caught, tears burning her eyes. For months she had longed to hear those words, yet now they felt even more powerful than she had imagined. She reached for him, pulling him close, her lips finding his in a kiss that sealed all the unspoken moments between them. The silence of the house broke at last, filled with the sound of two hearts binding themselves not by necessity, but by choice. From then on, the ranch no longer felt haunted. The rooms echoed with laughter, with the sound of Thomas's running feet, with the warmth of shared meals and quiet evenings by the fire. Luke was still a man of few words, but his gesture spoke, his hand brushing hers at the table, his steady presence beside her in church, the way he stood behind her when townsfolk dared whisper. Sarah found her strength deepening, no longer born of sheer survival but of belonging, of love that anchored her more firmly than land or money ever could. The banker came once more, bitterness sharp in his eyes as he found no weakness to exploit. "You're a lucky woman, Mrs. Tanner," he said with false courtesy. Sarah met his gaze squarely, her hand resting lightly on Luke's arm. "Luck had nothing to do with it," she replied, her voice calm and sure. "This home is built on more than debts and accounts. It's built on love, and no paper you hold can touch that." Word of her defiance spread through Dry Creek, and though some continued to gossip, others began to respect her. She was no longer the widow barely keeping her head above water. She was Sarah Tanner, wife, mother, partner in a ranch that thrived under the combined strength of two once broken souls. Seasons turned, the land healed, the cattle grew, and Thomas flourished under the steady hands of both his father and the woman he now called mother without hesitation. On winter nights, when the wind howled outside and the fire glowed warm within, Sarah often found herself staring at the man beside her, marveling at the path that had led her here. She had once thought herself ruined, destined to be swallowed by debt and despair. Yet here she was, alive with a love fiercer than she had ever known, part of a family bound together not by convenience, but by choice and sacrifice. One evening, as spring returned, Sarah stood on the porch watching the horizon, the fields green with promise. Luke came behind her, wrapping his arm around her waist, drawing her close. Thomas ran in the yard, laughing as he chased a stray calf. The sky blazed gold and crimson, the same as the night they had first spoken outside the bank, but now the shadows no longer felt threatening. "You were right," Sarah said softly, leaning against him. "You gave me a home. But more than that, you gave me a life." Luke pressed his lips to her hair, his voice rough with emotion. "And you gave me back my heart." Together they stood, the land stretching before them, no longer barren with loss but alive with hope. For in the union of two wounded hearts, a new strength had risen, one that could weather storms, silence gossip, and build a future that debt and despair could never steal away. And in that home, forged by fire, storm, and sacrifice, Sarah Tanner knew she had finally found what she had thought forever lost. Not just survival, but love.